How's it going, guys? David here. I hope you guys had a really great Thanksgiving weekend. Let's go ahead and talk about the imminent Nintendo 64 Classic that Nintendo's probably working on at the moment while they're trying to manufacture some more stock for the SNES, as well as possibly bringing back the NES Classic that so many people missed out on, including me, and possibly bringing some more stock to that so that hopefully we all get the rightful chance to at least nab one or at least have one in our hands. In the meantime, let's go ahead and put our daydreaming caps on and think about what games we would love to have on that little tiny system. And by we, I mean me. So here's my list of 10 games that I want to see on the N64 Classic personally. Your list is probably going to be very different from mine, and mine's going to be a very peculiar list, one that I'm a little interested to go through because it's going to be a mixture of games that I did play when I had my N64 back in the good old days, and also some games that I missed out on completely that I want the N64 Classic to have them at least so that I can jump back and be like, okay, so many people were talking about this game growing up that they were like, oh, the N64 games, we're talking about this one and we played that one, and I'm like, I missed out on them, dude. I don't know what you're talking about. So N64 Classic would be the perfect opportunity to reminisce about the games that I loved playing, while at the same time being able to kind of jump in to the conversation of what other people loved. A couple of disclaimers before I get started. The games that you're about to see in the list are in no particular order, so nothing's kind of overshadowing any other game in this list. It's just things that are kind of coming to my head, or at least coming off of my iPod, because that's where I put that on the list of games that I thought of that need to be on the N64 Classic. Which leads me to my other point, is that I'm pretty certain that the N64 Classic, despite having these games that are going to be a little bit more high fidelity compared to the games that were on the NES Classic and the SNES Classic, there's probably going to be, I want to bank on there being more than 10. Not just 10, but I want to say maybe around 15, possibly 20, but I think they're going to be pushing it at that point because the SNES came with 21, I think, 20 plus the Star Fox 2, and then the NES Classic did 30. So I'm expecting N64 Classic to do about maybe 15, maybe 20, around that realm. So there might be some more slots open for other games to kind of make the cut, but if I had to narrow it down to just 10, which is very plausible, that might just be the only amount of games that they could fit on this thing, then these are the 10 that I personally would want to see. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So I want to start off with some of the heavy hitters that are a little bit obvious, that I will admit there have been ports of these games on the 3DS, but there's something very, not only nostalgic, but almost kind of essential to the elements of these ports from the original N64 that you can't find in the remakes that you found on the 3DS because of the textures and because of how much of the charm is found in the way that they're texturized and the way that they're kind of put together. So that's why these next 3 games or so are going to be games that you probably already playing on the 3DS, but honestly they need to be on the N64. They made the N64. So let's start off with the humongously obvious one, Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Why should I dilute the point even more? It's one of the masterpieces of our generation. Back growing up with the N64, going through the journey. I've already talked about this in my N64 collection video and then my top 10 favorite N64 games growing up. I really don't need to beat this horse any more than of how self-explanatory it is that the Ocarina of Time game needs to be on the system. You could make a very valid point that maybe Majora's Mask could also kind of form some kind of contention, but Ocarina of Time, I mean, come on. And like I was saying earlier, there's something about the novelty within the textures and the music and the way it's all put together that needs to be put on the N64 in that form from 1996, as opposed to the remastered / remake that we got on the 3DS, which has the cleaner textures. That feels very appropriate for the 3DS, but for the N64 we need to have that original game as it was. And the exact same thing can be said for my next game, Super Mario 64. Again, the game that changed the dynamic for Mario, jumping from 2D to 3D, only this time, again, keeping those textures, keeping the music, while at the same time maybe finding a way to kind of, I don't know how to put this, but maybe take couple of elements from Odyssey and kind of put it in here. I haven't played Odyssey, but I played a handful of demos over at Best Buy where I work, and I feel like they could maybe go back into the infrastructure of Super Mario 64, fine-tune a couple things, and then pour it over into here, while at the same time keeping that aesthetic that we known from 1996 whenever that game came out, and still have it on this and still run well. Number 3 on the list, Star Fox 64. Once again, a very essential classic game of the Nintendo 64 that I will admit could be kind of bumped off the list. Like, I wouldn't be too upset if it doesn't show up on the system, only because, again, we did get that remake on the 3DS, but also because they didn't really change that much in terms of the textures. I mean, it was a little cleaned up, but for the most part, it kind of handled the same way that it did on the N64. So, just like I mentioned with Ocarina of Time Super Mario, if they do put it into the system, which I am banking that they will, because, again, it's a game that you think of when you think of N64 growing up, then they're gonna probably keep those aesthetics, keep those textures, and therefore keeping the charm that we all knew from Star Fox 64, so I really can't say more than that. Now, those were the obvious ones, so now with my number 4 game, I want to say that this is one that we've seen it be kind of reiterated into a number of sequels since this goddamn game, through various Nintendo systems, from the GameCube to the Wii, the Wii U, and now the Switch. But I feel like there's something unique about this version of the game that you almost can't really find anywhere else, and that is Mario Kart 64. Even though, like I said, there's been better versions where the gameplay has been refined, it's the tracks and it's the music that I think is actually rather unique, that you won't be able to find in some other versions of Mario Kart, even on the 3DS, like with Mario Kart 7, on the Switch right now with Mario Kart 8, Double Dash, any other version of Mario Kart. They try to kind of separate and become their own thing, despite being sequels, if that makes any kind of sense. And I feel like Mario Kart 64 had its own personality going, and I think it's time to put that personality to the test with a brand new version of that, only with, again, the same kind of textures and stuff like that. Just make sure that maybe the gameplay could be a little tweaked here and there, especially with some of the drifting and falling off that goddamn Rainbow Road, but I think Mario Kart 64 can find a very sweet spot on the N64 Classic. And I guess while we're on the subject of racing, F-Zero X. One explanation behind that, it's been goddamn forever since we got a proper F-Zero game. What was it? F-Zero GX was the last time we got an F-Zero game on the GameCube, and I missed that one. I've seen gameplay videos, I've seen other people play, and I'm like, oh, I wish I could play it, but for some stupid reason, I missed out on it with the GameCube. I'm pretty sure I can find it used or whatever, like on eBay or whatever, but I don't know. I'd rather have my own brand new copy. In the meantime, however, I think it would be a perfect opportunity to kind of fire those engines up, so to speak, by bringing F-Zero X to the N64 Classic. And then maybe, if it gets good reception, Nintendo, you know what to do with the Switch. Alright, now comes the left fielders, the ones that I never played, and sound a little weird for me to say that I want them to be on the system, but that's precisely why I want them to be on there, because I never played them. And they're very unique and very different, and I would often hear so many people talk about these games growing up that they're like, oh yeah, I remember this game on the N64. You know what? Put it on there. So I'm going to start off with Turok. Something Evolution. I can't remember what the subtitle is, but it's the very original Turok that so many people were talking about being actually one of the greater action games on the N64, where you'll go around, kill dinosaurs. It kind of had like a adventure / horror element to the entire thing. And I remember watching gameplay videos and stuff like that on TV or whatever, especially during these like little gaming segments on TV. It was Spanish TV, but they would have like a little segment that would cater to teenagers and younger kids, and they would often talk about the games that were going on the PlayStation 1 and on the N64, and they would cut back between those two, and even some Dreamcast stuff. And I remember one time they were kind of doing like a little walkthrough of Turok, and I would be rather impressed with that game, but I never thought to myself, like, I want to own that game as soon as I get in 64. Again, my mind was going mostly towards Mario and Zelda. Now, being older, I'm like, you know, I want to go back to what I missed. So with that kind of explanation, it makes sense that my next game is, of course, 007 GoldenEye. I mentioned this in my top 10 favorite games of N64 that I didn't put it on that list because I never actually grew up with GoldenEye. I played it a handful of times over at my cousin's house, but I never played it long enough and firmly enough to be able to go, holy shit, I love this game just like everybody else did. Which is a humongous, terrible shame, and I would love to be able to have that again with the N64 Classic. Now, the only two caveats to this is that, one, I will admit that based on some gameplay videos and the way that people have been talking about the game up to date, they say that as nostalgic and classic as that game is, gameplay mechanics, especially during the single player campaign, are not exactly the best, especially when you're going up against fucking Oddjob, and there's a break there in the game that hopefully will get patched up or fixed should GoldenEye come to fruition on the N64 Mini. The reason, however, that will likely not happen is only because the whole debacle between Rare owning the rights and now Rare being owned by Microsoft, hence the Rare Replay that came over on the Xbox One that had so many other games that came on the N64 Classic, on the original N64, and therefore they're not on this list. Games like Conker's Bad Fur Day, Perfect Dark, the Banjo-Kazooie games, that's why they're not on the list, because they were on that Rare Replay package. However, it always struck me rather curious that the GoldenEye game was not on that package. Could it be that maybe Nintendo struck some kind of deal with Rare and Microsoft, that they were able to like sell off everything else, give up everything, but keep GoldenEye? Possibly specifically for this. And it's wishful thinking at this point. Next few games are licensed games that are not exactly what you think of when you think of Nintendo, but there were very essential from what I hear on the N64, and one of them I always wanted to play, primarily because I played the game that came down later in the series, and I thought to myself, wow, if this was great, I want to see what those first two games were like, because I missed on them. Don't laugh when I say this. Pokemon Stadium. I know I had the choice between Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2. I'm going with the original because I always remember seeing this fucking game at Blockbuster and thinking to myself, God, I would love to rent it. I don't want to own it only because, again, at the time, I could only get games for the N64 either through my birthday or through my Christmas, so I had to be ultra selective. And I knew that it was between Pokemon Stadium or whatever else was coming out, like Smash Brothers or the new Mario game, or I can't remember. But I went with other games besides Pokemon Stadium. But I remember playing demos of Pokemon Stadium at Blockbuster when they had the kiosk, and it was so much fun. It was so much fun going through that. Like, it was like a straight up Pokemon game, because even though I didn't have this game on the N64, I did have a brand new Game Boy. It was the Pikachu Game Boy that came with Pokemon Yellow. And I remember playing Pokemon Yellow and becoming super addictive to Pokemon that way. It was my introduction to Pokemon, and it became like my drug. So thinking to myself, I could do this with 3D graphics on the N64, that was awesome, and I want to be able to make up for lost time that way. And then my last two games that I would love to see on the N64 Classic that will probably not be on there only because of, again, licensing issues, because we're dealing with a juggernaut of a license here, is Star Wars. Now, there's a shit ton of Star Wars games that came out throughout various systems, even on Nintendo systems like the GameCube, currently the Wii U as well. I don't think we've even seen something on the Switch just yet. Oh, hopefully, in due time. But going back to the N64, there were actually a rather good amount of awesome Star Wars games before, Yay. One of them was Rogue Squadron, another game that I did manage to do a couple of demos here and there, but I never was able to play the full-on game. It wasn't until the GameCube days that I managed to get Rogue Squadron 2 and 3, and I thought, wow, these games were really, really fun. It was a humongous shame that I did not play that original game. So, would love to make up for, again, lost time, to be able to go back to the original Rogue Squadron and kind of engage into the dogfights and have that option to be able to jump into that game. And then the other Star Wars game that I made room for on this list is Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. No, I'm joking. No, it's not. It's actually going to be, and I'm hoping I'm not getting this wrong, Star Wars Shadows of the Empire. I hear it's a really great game with an awesome story. There's like plot twists going down that make the story really engaging. Like it's like one of those self-contained stories, part of the expanded universe, that people were like, wow, this has no business being this great, and yet you're finding it on the N64 with some really good gameplay, and it's practically an RPG. I'm really hoping that I'm not confusing this game with Knights of the Old Republic, because it kind of sounds like it is, or just the Old Republic. I don't know, I can't remember, but I'm really hoping that I'm talking about Shadows of the Empire, and if it is, then I'm hoping that Nintendo and Star Wars can strike a good deal. It's a win-win for everybody, you know. Nintendo gets money, Star Wars is hot right now with the games and everything else coming out, plus Star Wars, LucasArts, you need a bounce back in the video game department after fucking Battlefront 2. Shadows of the Empire, forking it over into the N64 Classic would be probably your best move right now. And that does it for my list. Again, there's some games that you were probably expecting on this list, and it's because either I never really had that much of an affinity to them, or I did in fact play them, but I just didn't think that they would be appropriate on the N64 Classic because they just didn't age well, like that the original Smash Brothers. If we were to go back to classic Smash Brothers, I would rather put Melee on a GameCube Classic rather than to put the original on the N64 Classic. And of course, licensing issues will probably prevent a shit ton of other games to ever be brought back by Nintendo over to an official merchandise item. So, shit happens. But hopefully, here's to hoping that some of these games that I mentioned will find themselves on the N64 Classic. That is rather imminent at this point. What do you guys think? What games would you love to see that you grew up with playing the N64 on the N64 Classic? Do you think that there's going to be much more room for other entries? How many games do you expect the console to have, and which games are those going to be? Do you have a particular price point set in mind? I'm banking on $100 since it was $60 for NES Classic, $80 for SNES, and now I'm assuming N64 they're gonna start pushing it a little bit, and they're gonna go for $100. Yeah, hey, to be honest, with the N64, considering how much I love the system, I'm willing to go down for the $100. Just make sure you have plenty in stock, because God help us, you do that shit again. Let's all pray it doesn't. So feel free to support the video by hitting the like and share button. Make sure you post your comments and all your feedback down below, and of course subscribe to support the channel. I would really appreciate it, guys. Every little bit counts. So until next time, guys, see you all later. Just take it! Just take the sauce, whatever it is.
You're so stressed out.
Wait. Let me go get a tomato. Get a tomato.
You're so I can't.
Fuck! No, what are you doing?
Sorry, sorry. You're...
Hold on. No, stop. Stop. You're getting in my head. Okay.